Movies like Goodfellas show you the glamour first. The suits, the restaurants, the cash, the loyalty. The violence is there, but it is staged, scored, and cut away from before it gets truly uncomfortable. You leave the cinema thinking you understand what the mob was. You do not. The real Mafia did not look like a movie. It looked like a 12-year-old boy held in a cage for 779 days before being strangled and dissolved in acid. It looked like a judge blown off a highway by half a ton of explosives that registered on earthquake monitors. It looked like a candy store in Brooklyn where the pipes got so clogged with human blood that they nearly stopped working. The men in these cases were not characters. They were real. The victims were real. The methods were documented in court, confirmed under oath, and in some cases photographed on newspaper front pages around the world. This is what it actually looked like. Section 1. The Roy DeMeo Crew and the Gemini Method, 1976 to 1983. Roy DeMeo grew up in Brooklyn and learned to cut meat as a teenager working at a local butcher shop. He was good at it, precise, efficient. He quit that job in the early 1960s to run a loan sharking operation full-time, and by the mid-1970s, he had climbed far enough inside the Gambino crime family to run his own crew out of a bar he secretly owned on Flatlands Avenue in Canarsie, Brooklyn. The bar was called the Gemini Lounge. From the outside, it looked like nothing. A neighborhood dive with a jukebox and a small dance floor where couples did the hustle on Saturday nights. Off-duty cops drank there. College students stopped in. People placed bets with the bookies at the back. Nobody who walked through the front door had any reason to think the apartment attached to the building was being used as a slaughterhouse. DeMeo recruited a tight circle of killers around him, including Joey Testa and Anthony Center, who became so inseparable they were known as the Gemini Twins. He also installed his cousin Joseph Guglielmo, nicknamed Dracula, into the adjoining apartment as a live-in security measure to prevent law enforcement from planting listening devices. Dracula's apartment became the kill room. DeMeo stocked it with guns, ropes, knives, ice picks, and the kind of tools you find in a butcher's workspace. He kept a swimming pool liner on the floor for cleanup. The process DeMeo designed became known as the Gemini Method. It was revealed in full during federal court proceedings in the early 1980s through the testimony of multiple government witnesses, including crew members Dominic Montiglio, Frederick Denomi, and Vito Arena. According to their testimony, a target would be lured through the side door of the lounge and into the apartment. DeMeo, almost always personally, according to Denom's testimony, would approach the victim holding a silenced pistol in one hand and a towel in the other. He would shoot the victim in the head, then immediately wrap the towel around the wound like a turban to stop the blood from spreading across the floor. A second crew member would then stab the victim in the heart. The purpose was mechanical. Stopping the heart stopped the blood from pumping out of the gunshot wound. By that point, the victim was dead. The body would be stripped, dragged into the bathroom, and laid in the tub or shower while the remaining blood drained out. When the body was sufficiently drained, crew members, some working in their underwear to avoid staining their clothes, would carry it to the main room, lay it out on the pool liner, and dismember it. Arms, legs, head. The pieces went into plastic bags, then into cardboard boxes, which were driven to the Fountain Avenue dump in Brooklyn. In one documented case, DeMeo had a victim's severed head placed in a trash compactor. The FBI began formally investigating the DeMeo crew in the early 1980s after agents noticed the extraordinary number of people who had last been seen entering the Gemini Lounge and were never seen again. Agents from the Newark branch of the FBI had already raided a warehouse connected to DeMeo's enormous stolen car operation, one of the largest auto theft rings in New York City history in 1980. But it was the scale of the disappearances that brought the full weight of federal attention down on the Gemini Lounge. In a secretly recorded conversation captured by an FBI bug planted in the home of Gambino associate Angelo Ruggiero, John Gotti's brother Gene and associate Angelo were recorded discussing a contract that Gambino boss Paul Castellano had placed on DeMeo. The conversation revealed that John Gotti was reluctant to take the job because DeMeo had, in Gene Gotti's words, an army of killers around him. The recording also confirmed that at that point, Gotti had killed fewer than 10 people, while DeMeo had personally killed at least 38. Castellano could not find anyone willing to do it. The contract eventually went to DeMeo's own men, the Gemini twins. On January 10, 1983, DeMeo went to a meeting at a body shop in Canarsie. He did not come back. His son Albert later wrote in his 2002 autobiography that his father had known for weeks that he was marked for death and had become increasingly paranoid in his final days. On January 18, 1983, DeMeo's partially frozen body was found in the trunk of his own maroon Cadillac in a Brooklyn parking lot. He had been shot multiple times in the head. There was a bullet wound in his hand, consistent with him raising his arm when the shooting started. When law enforcement later searched the Gemini Lounge, the pipes were described as nearly clogged from the volume of blood that had gone through them. At the federal trial that followed, prosecutor William Mack Jr. stated on the record that the Roy DeMeo crew was the most violent crew ever prosecuted in federal court, describing DeMeo as having engaged in wholesale slaughter. Joey Testa and Anthony Center received life sentences for murder, plus an additional 20 years for racketeering. The FBI's overall estimate placed the crew's body count somewhere between 75 and 200 people over roughly 7 years. The Gemini Lounge itself went through several owners after DeMeo's death. It operated for a time as an Irish bar. Today, the building on the corner of Flatlands Avenue and Troy Avenue in East Flatbush houses a church called the Flatlands Church of God. The next section moves from a basement kill room in Brooklyn to a street corner in Midtown Manhattan, where a sitting mob boss was gunned down in front of dozens of witnesses during the Christmas rush. A hit so carefully planned, so openly executed, and so consequential for American organized crime that it rewrote the rules of who could be killed and how. Section 2. The Assassination of Paul Castellano. December 16, 1985. Paul Castellano was 70 years old and had been running the Gambino crime family, the largest and most powerful of New York's 5 families, since 1976. He lived in a mansion on Staten Island, so grand that people in the mob called it the White House. He had a housekeeper who became his mistress. He wore expensive suits. He preferred white-collar crimes over street violence, pushed the family toward construction rackets and legitimate businesses, and banned his men from dealing drugs under threat of death. That ban is what got him killed. John Gotti ran a crew out of Ozone Park, Queens, and had been making enormous amounts of money from heroin trafficking despite Castellano's explicit prohibition. The FBI had been watching. In August 1983, 2 of Gotti's closest associates, Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti, were arrested for heroin dealing, and the arrest was based on recordings from a bug planted in Ruggiero's home. Those tapes also contained derogatory comments about Castellano himself. When Castellano demanded copies of the transcripts, Ruggiero refused to hand them over, and Gotti backed his man. The relationship between Gotti and Castellano collapsed from that point forward. By late 1985, Castellano was facing 2 separate federal indictments simultaneously. One tied to a massive car theft operation linked to the DeMeo crew, and another as part of the Mafia commission trial, in which the government was prosecuting the leadership of all 5 families under federal racketeering law. Gotti's own crew was also under indictment. Both men were running out of time, and both men knew it. Castellano's longtime underboss, Aniello Della Croce, who had acted as a buffer between Castellano and the street crews, died of cancer on December 2, 1985. Castellano did not attend the wake. To men like Gotti, who had been loyal to Della Croce for years, the absence was a direct insult. Then Castellano named Thomas Bilotti, a loyalist with no diplomatic standing among the other captains, as his new underboss. And word reached Gotti that Castellano was planning to break up his crew entirely after Christmas. Gotti moved first. The location chosen was Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street near 3rd Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. Castellano had a meeting scheduled there on the evening of December 16, 1985. The hit team consisted of 4 men: Salvatore Scala, Vincent Artuso, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia. They positioned themselves near the entrance, wearing matching trench coats and Russian fur hats, so they could identify each other in the crowd. Additional backup shooters were stationed further down the block in case anything went wrong. Gotti and Gravano sat in a car on the opposite side of the street. They communicated with the hit team by walkie-talkie. At approximately 5:25 p.m., Bilotti pulled Castellano's car up to the restaurant entrance. Both men stepped out. The hit team moved in immediately. Castellano was shot 6 times and fell on the street outside the restaurant. Bilotti was shot and killed at almost the same moment, a short distance away. Gotti had one of his men drive him slowly past the scene to confirm both men were dead before leaving. The whole thing happened during the Christmas rush in one of the busiest parts of Manhattan, in front of multiple witnesses. No one was arrested that night. Within days, Gotti had effectively taken over the Gambino family. The other bosses of the 5 families were furious, not necessarily because Castellano was dead, but because Gotti had carried out the murder without getting approval from the commission first, which was a direct violation of the rules that governed how mob bosses could be removed. Genovese family boss Vincent Gigante was so angry that he personally ordered Gotti killed. Gotti survived the attempt, and eventually Gigante backed down. The federal government indicted Gotti 3 times in the late 1980s. Each time, he walked. Witness intimidation and jury tampering kept him clean, earning him the nickname, the Teflon Don. The press loved him. He held court outside his social club in Howard Beach in expensive suits, gave out turkeys at Thanksgiving, and set off fireworks on the 4th of July. He became the most famous mob boss in the country. His undoing came from inside his own organization. The FBI planted bugs in Gotti's Ravenite social club in Manhattan's Little Italy and recorded hundreds of hours of conversation. On those recordings, Gotti was heard boasting about ordering the deaths of associates who had crossed him. When Gotti's underboss, Sammy Gravano, was played those recordings in 1991, he heard his own name mentioned as a potential target. Gravano agreed to cooperate with the government and became one of the most significant mob informants in American history, confessing to 19 murders and implicating Gotti in 4 of them. At trial in 1992, Gravano took the stand and described the Castellano assassination in full: the planning, the positioning of the hit team, the walkie-talkies, Gotti watching from across the street. The jury convicted Gotti on all 13 counts, including the murders of Castellano and Bilotti. On June 23, 1992, he was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He died of throat cancer at the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, on June 10, 2002. He was 61 years old. Castellano's murder outside Sparks Steakhouse in December 1985 remains the last time a sitting New York mob boss was assassinated on American soil until the killing of Gambino boss Frank Cali in Staten Island in March 2019. a gap of 34 years. Quote, 0, __. The next section leaves New York entirely and goes back more than 50 years earlier to Chicago, where 7 men were lined up against a garage wall on Valentine's Day morning and shot so many times that the forensic investigation that followed essentially invented the science of ballistics as we know it today. Section 3. The Street. Valentine's Day Massacre, February 14th, 1929. Chicago in the late 1920s was running on illegal alcohol. Prohibition had been the law of the land since 1920, and the city had become the most profitable territory in the country for anyone willing to supply what the government had banned. Al Capone, running the South Side operation known as the Chicago Outfit, had built an organization generating an estimated $40 million a year by 1929. The one man still standing between Capone and complete control of the city was George Bugs Moran, who ran the North Side Gang out of a garage at 2122 North Clark Street in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Capone was in Miami on the morning of February 14th. He made sure of that. The plan required a phone call. Someone, the identity was never confirmed in court, contacted Moran's men on February 13th with an offer: a truckload of hijacked whiskey available for purchase to be delivered to the Clark Street garage at 10:30 the following morning. Moran's men showed up. Moran himself was running late. He was still outside on the street, saw what he thought were police cars outside the garage, and walked away. That decision saved his life. Inside the garage that morning were 6 members and associates of the North Side Gang, and one man who had no real criminal role at all. Frank and Pete Gusenberg were Moran's most reliable enforcers. Adam Heyer managed the gang's finances. Albert Weinshank ran several cleaning businesses as fronts. James Clark was Moran's brother-in-law. John May was a mechanic with 7 children who worked on the gang's cars. Reinhard Schwimmer was an optician who simply enjoyed spending time around gangsters. All 7 were in the garage when the attack began. 4 men arrived in a black Cadillac, the type commonly used by Chicago police at the time. 2 of them were dressed in police uniforms. The other 2 wore civilian clothes. They entered the garage, announced what appeared to be a routine raid, and ordered all 7 men to line up facing the brick wall at the back of the building. The men complied. They had dealt with police raids before. Complying was standard procedure. What happened next took less than a minute. 2 Thompson submachine guns and at least 1 sawed-off shotgun opened fire. Investigators later recovered more than 70 spent .45 caliber cartridge cases from the garage floor. 6 of the 7 men died immediately. Frank Gusenberg, shot 14 times, was still alive when police arrived. A detective asked him who had shot him. Gusenberg refused to say. He died in hospital 3 hours later without identifying anyone. The crime scene photographs were published in newspapers across the country. Bodies collapsed against the wall and across the floor. Blood across the brick. The image became one of the most reproduced photographs of the Prohibition era and permanently fixed Chicago's identity as the capital of American organized crime. Every major suspect was connected to Capone. Machine Gun Jack McGurn, one of Capone's most trusted operatives, was indicted in March 1929, along with another Capone gunman named John Scalise. Scalise was murdered before his case went to trial. McGurn's girlfriend, later his wife, provided him with an alibi, and the charges against him were eventually dropped. Capone himself was in Florida and could not be directly tied to the order. No one was ever convicted of the 7 murders. The case stalled for nearly 10 months. Then, in December 1929, a man named Fred Burke got drunk, crashed his car in St. Joseph, Michigan, and shot a police officer named Charles Skelly 3 times when Skelly intervened. Skelly died 3 hours later. When police raided Burke's home, They found $310,000 in stolen bonds, 6 tear gas bombs, 2 rifles, a sawed-off shotgun, approximately 5,000 rounds of ammunition, and 2 Thompson submachine guns. Those guns changed the history of forensic science. Dr. Calvin Goddard was a pioneer in the emerging field of ballistics identification. He had already established the Bureau of Forensic Ballistics in New York in 1925 and had spent years developing the use of the comparison microscope to match fired bullets and shell casings to specific weapons. His core finding was straightforward. No 2 guns produce identical marks on the ammunition they fire. Every weapon leaves a unique signature on every bullet and casing it touches. Distinctive patterns from the breech face, firing pin, extractor, and ejector that are consistent every time that specific gun is fired. Goddard test-fired the 2 Thompsons recovered from Burke's house and compared the results microscopically against the cartridge cases and bullet fragments collected from the Clark Street garage on February 14th. The breech face marks, firing pin impressions, and extractor signatures matched precisely. The guns were cataloged in court records as Exhibit A, serial number 7580, and Exhibit B. Goddard also determined that one of the same weapons had been used to kill New York mobster Frankie Yale 18 months earlier. Burke was tried in Michigan for the murder of Officer Skelly, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. He was never extradited to Illinois or tried for the massacre itself. The impact of Goddard's work on the massacre investigation went beyond the case. Chicago business leaders on the coroner's jury, impressed by what the science had demonstrated, funded the creation of a private forensic laboratory at Northwestern University, the first institution of its kind in the United States, kept deliberately separate from the corruption-riddled Chicago Police Department. That laboratory became the direct model for the FBI crime lab established 2 years later. The massacre that killed 7 men in under a minute had, as a byproduct, built the foundation of modern forensic investigation in America. The 2 Tommy guns from Burke's house and a preserved section of the original Clark Street garage wall, bullet damage still visible in the bricks, are on permanent display at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. The next section crosses the Atlantic entirely to a motorway in Sicily where the real Mafia, the organization that the American mob was built from, planted half a ton of explosives under a highway to kill the one judge who had come closer than anyone in history to destroying them. Section 4. The Assassination of Judge Giovanni Falcone, May 23, 1992. Giovanni Falcone grew up in Palermo, Sicily, in the same neighborhood as Paolo Borsellino. They played soccer together as boys on the Piazza Magione. Some of their childhood friends grew up to become mafiosi. Falcone and Borsellino became prosecutors. By the mid-1980s, the 2 men were working side by side in a windowless, bomb-proof bunker beneath the Palermo courthouse, building the largest criminal case ever brought against the Sicilian Mafia. The organization they were targeting was Cosa Nostra, Italian for our thing. It had existed in Sicily since the 1870s, had penetrated the highest levels of Italian politics, business, and law enforcement, and by the 1980s was running one of the most profitable heroin trafficking operations in the world, shipping product directly to the Gambino crime family in New York. For decades, Italian courts had treated Cosa Nostra as a loose collection of individual criminals rather than a single unified organization. Falcone changed that. He was the first prosecutor to use informants, called pentiti or penitents, systematically against the organization. The most significant was Tommaso Buscetta, a senior Cosa Nostra member who agreed to cooperate after the organization killed his 2 sons, his brother, his son-in-law, and several other relatives during an internal power struggle in the early 1980s. Buscetta gave Falcone a detailed map of how Cosa Nostra actually functioned, its internal hierarchy, its ruling body called the Commission, its rules, its rituals, and the names of the men who ran it. That information became the foundation of what followed. The Maxi trial began in February 1986 inside a specially constructed bunker courthouse in Palermo. It ran for nearly 2 years. When it concluded in December 1987, 338 members of Cosa Nostra had been convicted. 19 received life sentences. It was the most comprehensive legal defeat in the organization's history. Cosa Nostra spent the next several years appealing those convictions through the Italian court system. On January 30, 1992, the Supreme Court of Cassation, Italy's highest court, confirmed the verdicts. The appeals were finished. The sentences stood. Within weeks, the organization's ruling body, headed by boss of bosses Salvatore Totorina, decided to go to war with the Italian state. Riina's logic was direct. If the courts could not be manipulated from within through corrupt judges and politicians, they would be destroyed from the outside through murder. The first target was Salvo Lima, a Sicilian politician and ally of Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, who had promised Cosa Nostra he could influence the appeals process and had failed to deliver. Lima was shot dead on March 12, 1992. The second target was Falcone. Riina tasked Giovanni Brusca with planning and executing the assassination. Brusca was one of Riina's most reliable killers, known in Sicily by the nickname Lo Scanna Cristiani, the people slaughterer. Riina specified that the hit had to happen in Sicily, as a public demonstration of Cosa Nostra's power and reach. The chosen location was the A29 motorway between Palermo International Airport and the city of Palermo. The road Falcone used every week when he flew in from Rome, where he had been working at the Justice Ministry. The planning was meticulous. In April and May 1992, senior members of the organization conducted multiple inspection visits to the Capaci area of the highway to identify the optimal location. They identified a drainage culvert running beneath the road. Test drives were conducted repeatedly, using flashbulbs to simulate the timing of detonating a charge against a moving vehicle at highway speed. A concrete structure was built specifically to test whether the explosive quantity would generate sufficient force. Tree branches blocking sight lines from the planned detonation point were cut away. On the evening of May 8th, Brusca and his crew arranged 13 steel barrels, loaded with approximately 400 kilograms of quarry explosives, onto a skateboard, which was then pushed into the drainage tunnel beneath the highway. Additional surveillance teams monitored Falcone's movements in Rome to track when he would be traveling. On May 23, 1992, Falcone boarded a flight from Rome to Palermo. A lookout confirmed the departure. On the ground in Sicily, surveillance teams tracked the convoy of 3 Fiat Cromas leaving the airport. Falcone was driving the lead car himself, with his wife Francesca Morvillo, also a magistrate, in the passenger seat. 3 bodyguards traveled with them: Rocco Di Cilo, Antonio Montinaro, and Vito Schifani. Giovanni Brusca was positioned on a hill overlooking the highway with a remote detonator. At 5:56 p.m., as Falcone's convoy passed over the culvert at highway speed, Brusca pressed the button. The explosion was so powerful that it was recorded by seismic monitoring equipment tracking volcanic activity on Mount Etna on the other side of the island. It tore a crater in the highway approximately 30 meters wide. The lead car was thrown off the road entirely. Giovanni Falcone, Francesca Morvillo, and all 3 bodyguards were killed instantly. The force of the blast was felt in Palermo itself, miles away. 57 days later, on July 19, 1992, Paolo Borsellino was killed by a car bomb on Via D'Amelio in Palermo, just as he was arriving at his mother's apartment building. 5 police officers in his escort were also killed. The murders produced a national reckoning in Italy. Riina was arrested in Palermo on January 15, 1993, after 23 years as a fugitive. He died in prison in 2017 while serving multiple life sentences. Giovanni Brusca, who pressed the detonator, was convicted of Falcone's murder and is serving a life sentence. Dozens of other men were convicted for their roles in planning and executing the attack. In a later trial in 2014, 4 additional defendants, Salvatore Madonia, Cosimo Lonigro, Giorgio Pizzo, and Lorenzo Tinirello, were sentenced to life imprisonment for their role in acquiring the explosives and preparing the site. A garden of memory now stands at the location of the explosion on the A29. Olive trees grow there. The oil they produce is used by Sicilian churches for baptisms and confirmations. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section stays with the theme of organizations that treated murder as routine business, but moves back to America and into one of the most disturbing cases of revenge killing the Chicago mob ever carried out, where 2 brothers walked into a basement meeting expecting a promotion and were beaten to death by a dozen men waiting in the dark. Section 5. The Spilotro Brothers Murder. June 14, 1986. Anthony Spilotro had been the Chicago outfit's man in Las Vegas since 1971. His job was to oversee the mob's casino skimming operation, the process by which the outfit was systematically stealing cash from the counting rooms of casinos, including the Stardust, the Fremont, the Hacienda, and the Marina, before it could be reported to the IRS. It was one of the most profitable rackets in the history of American organized crime, and Spilotro was supposed to protect it by keeping a low profile and making sure nothing attracted federal attention to Las Vegas. He did the opposite. Spilotro was short, barely 5'5", and had earned the nickname Tony the Ant as a young man in Chicago, reportedly because a hitman once described him as being so small he wasn't worth killing. That description aged poorly. By the time he arrived in Las Vegas, the FBI suspected him of involvement in at least 22 murders. He formed a burglary crew called the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, which broke into homes and businesses across Las Vegas, with Spilotro taking a percentage of every score. He conducted beatings and killings openly enough that his name was appearing in newspapers. He was photographed smiling outside a Las Vegas courthouse in April 1986 after a racketeering trial ended in a mistrial. He was having an affair with the wife of Frank Lefty Rosenthal, the Chicago bookie who managed the casino skim operation and who Spilotro was supposed to be protecting. The affair was public knowledge. Chicago outfit boss Joseph Aiuppa had been watching all of it. When Aiuppa himself was sent to prison in the spring of 1986, partly as a result of testimony from people connected to Spilotro's own crew, he reportedly said of Spilotro, "I don't care how you do it. Get him. I want him out." Michael Spilotro, Anthony's younger brother, was 41 years old and ran a restaurant called Hoagie's in Chicago. He was a part-time actor and had no major criminal record compared to his brother. He was also facing federal extortion charges at the time of his death. The decision to kill Michael alongside Anthony was made to eliminate any possibility of revenge. The plan was built around a lie. James Marcello, a senior figure in the Chicago outfit, contacted the brothers with an offer that neither of them could reasonably refuse. Anthony was going to be promoted to capo, a formal captaincy in the organization, and Michael was going to be inducted as a full member. On Saturday, June 14, 1986, around 2 p.m., the brothers left Michael's townhouse at 1102 South Maple Avenue in Oak Park, Illinois, in Michael's 1986 Lincoln Continental. Before he left, Michael told someone that if he was not back by 9 o'clock that night, it was no good. His wife, Ann, later confirmed this in testimony. Marcello drove them to a house in Bensonville, Illinois, a suburb adjacent to O'Hare International Airport. They went down to the basement. According to the testimony of Nicholas Calabrese, a member of the Chicago outfit who participated in the murders and later became the first made member of the Chicago outfit ever to cooperate with the federal government, approximately 12 to 15 men were waiting in that basement. The moment the brothers came down the stairs, the room collapsed on them. Calabrese testified that he personally tackled Michael Spilotro and held his legs while another man strangled Michael with a rope. He testified that Anthony, in those first seconds of chaos, managed to ask his killers one question: "Can I say a prayer?" There was no reply. Anthony Spilotro was swarmed immediately. Michael had a small .22 caliber handgun in his pocket, but never got to it. Forensic pathologist Dr. John Pless, who testified at the 2007 federal trial, stated that autopsies of both brothers showed the cause of death was multiple blunt force trauma to the head, neck, and chest, consistent with punches, kicks, and knees rather than weapons. Both men died partly because their lungs and airways filled with blood to the point where they could no longer breathe. The autopsy confirmed they were already dead when they were buried. Their bodies were driven approximately 100 miles south to a cornfield near Enos, Indiana, in the Willow Slough Preserve, stripped down to their underwear, placed in a 5-foot grave, one on top of the other, and covered. The burial was botched. A farmer noticed the freshly turned earth days later, thought someone had illegally buried a deer out of season, and contacted authorities. On June 22, 1986, 8 days after the murders, the grave was found. The brothers were identified by dental x-rays provided by their brother, Patrick Spilotro, a dentist. Michael's Lincoln Continental was found in a motel parking lot near O'Hare Airport several days later. The man who drove the brothers to their deaths, James Marcello, was convicted by a federal jury on September 27, 2007, for the murders of both Anthony and Michael Spilotro. On February 5, 2009, U.S. District Judge James Zagel sentenced Marcello to life in prison. Nicholas Calabrese, who testified for 5 days across the family secrets trial and admitted to participating in the Spilotro killings and more than a dozen other murders, was sentenced on March 26, 2009, to 12 years and 4 months. At Marcello's sentencing, Patrick Spilotro, the dentist brother who had identified his brother's remains by their dental records more than 20 years earlier, addressed the court. He referenced the moment Anthony had asked to say a prayer before being killed. "Those who denied my brothers a prayer," he said, his voice trailing off, "deserve no mercy." Martin Scorsese's 1995 film Casino depicted Anthony Spilotro as the character Nicky Santoro, played by Joe Pesci. In the film, Nicky and his brother are beaten with baseball bats in a cornfield and buried alive. The actual facts, as established in court, were different. The beating happened in a basement in suburban Chicago, not a field, and both men were already dead before they were put in the ground. The truth, as established by an autopsy and confirmed under oath, was in some ways worse than the movie. Casino showed 2 men being hit with bats. The reality was 12 men in a basement using their hands, feet, and a rope. The next section moves from a mob hit designed to silence 2 brothers to one of the most disturbing cases of revenge the Mafia ever carried out against a child. A 12-year-old boy kidnapped by the Sicilian Cosa Nostra and held prisoner for 779 days before being killed, because his father had the courage to testify against them. Section 6. The murder of Giuseppe Di Matteo. Child held 779 days, then killed on November 23, 1993. A group of men arrived at the home of a 12-year-old boy in Sicily and told him they were police officers. They said they were there to take him to see his father. The boy believed them and went with them willingly. He would not see his home, his mother, or the outside world again. His name was Giuseppe Di Matteo. His father, Santino Di Matteo, was a member of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra who had been arrested on June 4, 1993, and had made the decision to cooperate with Italian authorities. Santino had been directly involved in the 1992 Capaci bombing that killed Judge Giovanni Falcone. After his arrest, he became the first of Falcone's assassins to turn government witness, and he gave investigators everything: who had packed the 13 drums with explosives, who had hauled them into the drainage culvert on a skateboard, and who had pressed the button that detonated them. The man he named as the person who pressed that button was Giovanni Brusca. Brusca was still free when Giuseppe was taken. He ordered the kidnapping himself, in coordination with Leo Luca Bagarella, another senior figure in the Corleonesi clan. The strategy was straightforward: take the boy, and Santino would stop talking. The men who took Giuseppe disguised themselves as law enforcement, specifically because a child would not run from police. Giuseppe walked out of his house and into a van, believing he was going to see his father. He was held in a series of locations over the following months, kept in conditions described in court proceedings as squalid, confined, beaten, underfed. The people holding him photographed him during this period and sent the images to Santino while he was in protective custody. The photographs showed his son in visible distress. They were sent as a message about what continuing to cooperate with the government would cost him. Santino did not retract his testimony. He came out of hiding at one point and traveled back to Sicily in a desperate attempt to negotiate directly for his son's release. It achieved nothing. The men holding Giuseppe had no intention of releasing him, regardless of what his father did or didn't do. By that point, the boy had become something beyond a bargaining tool. He was the punishment itself, extended for as long as possible. The kidnapping lasted 779 days. Giuseppe Di Matteo spent more than 2 years as a prisoner, held by men who treated his suffering as a practical instrument. He was 12 years old when he was taken. He was 14 when Brusca gave the final order to kill him. The 5 words Brusca reportedly used to issue that order were, "Get rid of the puppy." On January 11, 1996, Giuseppe was strangled. By this point, according to accounts confirmed in court proceedings, the boy was so physically weakened from more than 2 years of mistreatment that he did not resist. After he was dead, his body was dissolved in a barrel of acid, a practice the Sicilian Mafia referred to as lupara bianca, meaning white shotgun, a term used for killings where no body is ever found. No physical remains of Giuseppe Di Matteo were ever recovered. Italian police described it publicly as one of the most heinous crimes in the history of Cosa Nostra. Brusca was arrested on May 20, 1996, 4 months after Giuseppe's murder, near Agrigento in Sicily, after years as a fugitive. After his arrest, he also became a government witness, cooperating with authorities and providing testimony that helped convict dozens of other Cosa Nostra members. In 1999, a court in Palermo sentenced Brusca to 30 years in prison specifically for the murder of Giuseppe Di Matteo. His brother Enzo received 28 years. 3 other men received sentences between 20 and 27 years for their roles. In subsequent trials, as additional informants came forward, further convictions followed. In 2012, 5 more men, including Matteo Messina Denaro and Giuseppe Graviano, received life sentences for their roles in the murder. In 1997, Santino Di Matteo and Giovanni Brusca came face-to-face during court proceedings in Palermo. Santino, seeing the man who had ordered his son's death sitting across from him, told the judge directly, "I guarantee my collaboration, but to this animal, I guarantee nothing. If you leave me alone with him for 2 minutes, I'll cut off his head." Court security guards moved to restrain him. Because Brusca cooperated extensively with authorities after his arrest, his multiple sentences were reduced. He was released from Rome's Rebibbia prison on May 31, 2021, after serving approximately 25 years, and placed on 4 years of parole. His release prompted immediate public outrage across Italy. Tina Montanaro, the widow of Antonio Montanaro, one of Falcone's bodyguards killed in the Capaci bombing, said publicly that the state was against the victims. Giuseppe's family had been awarded 2.2 million euros in compensation by an Italian court in 2018. Brusca was discharged from parole on June 4, 2025. Giuseppe Di Matteo's mother, Franca Castellese, spoke at the inauguration of a memorial garden dedicated to her son in 2008. She said, "We have won. Indeed, Giuseppe won, because I think that thanks to him the Mafia has been exterminated, if not at least 70%. There is no body to visit. There is no grave. The acid made sure of that." Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves from a child killed to silence a witness to a mob boss shot dead in a barbershop. Albert Anastasia, the man who ran organized crime's most prolific murder operation and ended up on the floor of a Manhattan hotel with 2 gunmen standing over him, finally getting what decades of enemies had been waiting to deliver. Section 7. The Assassination of Carmine Galante. July 12, 1979. Carmine Galante was 69 years old and had been running heroin into New York City on a scale that law enforcement had never seen before. He had grown up in East Harlem, the son of Sicilian immigrants, dropped out of school by the age of 15, and been arrested for the first time at 10 years old. By the time he reached adulthood, he was working as an enforcer for Vito Genovese, carrying out murders for the Mafia during an era when bodies were expected to pile up. The NYPD suspected him of involvement in between 80 and 100 murders over his lifetime. A police lieutenant once told a reporter that not since the days of Vito Genovese had there been a more ruthless and feared individual in New York organized crime. Galante had been released from federal prison in 1974 after serving time for drug trafficking, and he came back with one idea. He was going to be the most powerful man in American organized crime. The official boss of the Bonanno family at the time was Philip Rastelli, who was in prison. Galante simply ignored Rastelli's authority and took control of the family himself. He then declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, over the entire New York underworld. The other 4 families viewed this as delusional and dangerous in equal measure. His weapon was heroin. Galante had spent years building connections between the Bonanno family and Sicilian drug suppliers, and after his release from prison, he used those connections to flood the city with product. He surrounded himself with a crew of imported Sicilian Mafia members, referred to by American mobsters as Zips, who served as his personal protection force. He trusted them over American-born mobsters, believing, as he told people more than once, that American criminals had gone soft. His 2 most visible bodyguards were Baldassare Amaro and Cesare Bonventre, young Sicilians who accompanied him everywhere. Throughout the late 1970s, Galante ordered the murders of at least 8 Gambino family members to consolidate his grip on the heroin market. He was photographed openly, gave no effort to keeping a low profile, and was featured by name in a 1977 New York Times story with the headline, "An obscure gangster is emerging as the Mafia chieftain in New York." He had been quoted telling associates that no one would ever kill him, that they would not dare. The other bosses of the 5 families reached a different conclusion. Genovese's family boss, Frank Thierry, began working the phones, consulting with other mob leaders across the country to build a consensus for Galante's removal. The retired Joseph Bonanno, the family's founder, reportedly gave his approval. Philip Rastelli, still the official Bonanno boss, actively sought commission authorization to have Galante killed. The authorization was granted. The men chosen to carry out the hit included Anthony Bruno Indelicato, the son of a Bonanno capo, along with several others. The logistics required one more element. Someone had to make sure Galante's own bodyguards would stand down. Bonanno capos Alphonse Sunny Red Indelicato and Dominic Sunny Black Napolitano approached Amato and Bonventry privately and made them a deal. Step aside during the hit, and both men would be promoted and given a larger share of the family's drug operation. Amato and Bonventry accepted. On the morning of July 12, 1979, the temperature in Brooklyn was 87 degrees. Galante went to Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant at 205 Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick, a restaurant owned by his cousin Giuseppe Tirano, a Bonanno soldier, to share a lunch and say goodbye to Tirano, who was leaving on vacation to Sicily. Galante, Amato, and Bonventry sat at a table on the outdoor back patio with Tirano and Leonard Coppola, a Bonanno capo and longtime Galante associate. They ate fish, salad, and wine. Before coffee and dessert arrived, Galante lit a cigar. Shortly before 2:45 p.m., a phone call came into the restaurant from a man who identified himself as Jimmy Galante, Carmine's nephew and driver, asking whether his uncle was there. John Tirano, the 25-year-old son of the restaurant owner, took the call and confirmed that Galante was in the back patio. Minutes later, 3 men in ski masks entered through the front of the restaurant. John Tirano, recognizing what was about to happen, warned his father and ran to a storeroom, pulling the door shut. He heard one of the men say in the back, "Sally." The gunman walked through to the patio and opened fire with shotguns and handguns. Galante was hit by a shotgun blast to the upper chest and by bullets that struck his left eye. He was hurled backward off his chair and into a small tomato patch growing against the back wall of the patio. Tirano and Coppola were killed instantly alongside him. Amato and Bonventry, sitting at the same table, were untouched. They made no attempt to intervene during the shooting and left the restaurant together afterward without being detained. The hit team fled out the front. When police and photographers arrived at the patio, Galante was lying dead in the tomato patch with a cigar still clamped between his teeth. The photograph of his body, sprawled on the ground, cigar in mouth, eyes open, was published on newspaper front pages across the world the following morning and became one of the most reproduced images in the history of American organized crime. When morgue attendants carried his body out of Joe and Mary's on a stretcher, it passed beneath a sign above the door that read, "We give special attention to outgoing orders." The Archdiocese of New York refused to allow a funeral mass for Galante, citing his criminal history. Tirano and Coppola, who died alongside him, were granted Catholic burials. Only one man was ever formally charged for the killing. Anthony Bruno Indelicato was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison on January 13, 1987. His 2 former colleagues, Sunny Red Indelicato and Dominic Sunny Black Napolitano, who coordinated the logistics of the hit, were both dead before any charges could reach them, killed themselves in subsequent mob power struggles. Amato and Bonventry, the bodyguards who sold their boss for a promotion, also met violent ends years later. Of all the people involved in planning and carrying out Galante's murder, the Mob Museum notes that only one was ever brought to justice. The next section moves to Philadelphia, where the murder of one mob boss set off a chain reaction of revenge killings that ended with a body found in a car trunk stuffed with a very specific amount of cash. A message from the mob that was as deliberate and symbolic as anything they ever did with a gun. Section 8. The Angelo Bruno/Antonio Caponigro murders, 1980. Angelo Bruno had been running the Philadelphia crime family since 1959 and had done it in a way that made him genuinely unusual among American mob bosses. He did not like violence. He preferred bribery over murder, negotiation over bloodshed, and he had a genuine reputation for fairness that earned him respect from mob leadership in New York. He had been given the nickname the Docile Don and the Gentle Don, not as insults, but as accurate descriptions of how he operated. When a boss named Antonio Polina had tried to have Bruno killed in 1959, Bruno found out, went to New York, used his relationship with Gambino family boss Carlo Gambino to get the commission's protection and was appointed boss as a result. Polina was demoted to soldier. Bruno spared his life entirely. In 2 decades as boss, that kind of restraint defined his leadership. Bruno was 69 years old in the spring of 1980. He had kept Philadelphia relatively stable and relatively quiet for 20 years. He forbade family members from dealing drugs and kept violence to a minimum. Those 2 policies were exactly what got him killed. The man who arranged his murder was Antonio Caponigro, known as Tony Bananas, a name that came from his father's profession as a banana merchant in Newark. Caponigro was Bruno's consigliere, the 3rd-ranking position in the family, and he operated out of Newark, New Jersey, where he ran a bookmaking and numbers operation worth approximately $2 million annually. He was described by law enforcement as a known sociopath. His frustration with Bruno had been building for years. Bruno had refused to allow the family into the methamphetamine trade, a decision that Caponigro believed was costing everyone money. He had also allowed New York families to deal heroin on Philadelphia territory, while blocking his own men from doing the same, which created resentment throughout the organization. Caponigro traveled to New York to meet with Frank Thierry, the boss of the Genovese crime family. Thierry had his own grievances against Bruno. He had been trying to claim a larger percentage of Caponigro's bookmaking operation in Hudson County, and Bruno had backed Caponigro in the dispute. Caponigro told Thierry he wanted to remove Bruno and take over the Philadelphia family. Thierry told Caponigro he would get the commission's approval for the hit. He never went to the commission. He told Caponigro he had approval when he did not. Whether Thierry did this to manipulate Caponigro into doing something that would destroy him, or simply to destabilize the Philadelphia family, is not entirely clear from the record. The result was the same either way. Caponigro believed he had the blessing of the national governing body of American organized crime to murder a sitting boss. He did not. On the evening of March 21, 1980, Angelo Bruno had dinner at his favorite Italian restaurant in South Philadelphia and was driven home afterward by his bodyguard and driver, John Stanfa. Stanfa pulled up in front of Bruno's row house at the intersection of 10th Street and Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia. Bruno sat in the car smoking a cigarette. Stanfa gave a signal. An assassin, believed by investigators to be Caponigro's cousin Alfred Salerno, came up behind the car with a shotgun, placed the barrel behind Bruno's right ear, and fired once. Bruno died instantly. Stanfa was wounded in the hand during the attack. He survived and was later convicted of other crimes. Bruno's murder shocked the commission. A boss, a full member of the national governing body of the American Mafia, had been killed without authorization. This was one of the clearest violations of mob law that existed. The commission moved immediately. Caponigro was summoned to a meeting in New York. He arrived expecting to be confirmed as Philadelphia's new boss. When he was confronted about the unsanctioned murder, he turned to Frank Thierry and identified him as the man who had authorized the hit. Thierry, sitting in the same room, denied it completely. There was nothing Caponigro could say. He had no documentation, no witnesses, and no allies in that room who were going to back him up. The commission ruled that he had murdered a boss without authorization. The meeting ended, and Caponigro did not leave New York alive. On April 18, 1980, 28 days after Bruno's murder, the bodies of Antonio Caponigro and his brother-in-law Alfred Salerno were found in the trunks of 2 separate cars left a few miles apart in the South Bronx. Both men were naked and battered. Caponigro's body showed 14 bullet and knife wounds. His mouth and his body cavities had been stuffed with cash, approximately $300 in bills. The money was a deliberate message, inserted to symbolize that his greed had been the cause of his death. Joe Mad Dog Sullivan, a mob enforcer, later admitted in an on-camera interview in 2010 that he personally shot and killed Caponigro. The commission then went through every person in the Philadelphia family who had known about or participated in the Bruno murder plot. The cleanup was systematic. John Simone, a Philadelphia capo who had been involved in the conspiracy, was found dead on September 17, 1980. Frank Sindone, a soldier who had helped plan the murder and expected to become underboss under Caponigro, was found in an alley behind a store in South Philadelphia on October 29, 1980, shot 3 times in the head. 4 men connected to the plot against Angelo Bruno were killed within 7 months of Bruno's death. The family Bruno had kept stable for 20 years descended into more than 2 decades of internal warfare. His successor, Philip Chicken Man Testa, was himself killed less than a year later by a nail bomb planted under the porch of his home. Testa's successor was Nicodemo Little Nicky Scarfo, the violently unstable soldier Bruno had exiled to Atlantic City years earlier for being too dangerous to keep in Philadelphia. Under Scarfo, the family killed more than 30 of its own members over the following decade. Bruno's daughter, Jean, told Philadelphia Magazine in 2017 that she sees her father's killing every time she leaves the house. He was shot in front of his home, on a street she still knows. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section crosses back to New York and into the 1930s and 1940s, when organized crime built an entire corporation devoted to nothing but murder. A killing operation so efficient and so far-reaching that the government had to invent new laws just to understand what they were dealing with. Section 9. The Murder Inc. Operation Albert Anastasia and the Syndicate's Killing Machine, 1930s to 1940s. In the early 1930s, the bosses of American organized crime sat down and solved what they considered a management problem. The problem was simple. The mob was killing too many people without authorization, and all those unsanctioned murders were bringing heat from law enforcement down on their businesses. The solution they arrived at was, by any measure, extraordinary. They created a dedicated murder operation, a standing crew of contract killers available to any member of the National Crime Syndicate, anywhere in the country, for a fee. The organization had no official name. Newspapers would eventually call it Murder Inc. The 2 men placed in charge were Louis Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia. Buchalter was one of the most powerful labor racketeers in American history, having spent years muscling his way into control of New York's garment industry unions, using the threat of strikes and violence to extract money from both management and workers simultaneously. Anastasia was something different entirely. He had been convicted of murder in 1921 for killing a longshoreman named George Torino, sentenced to death, sent to Sing Sing to await execution, and then walked free on a technicality when 4 prosecution witnesses disappeared before his retrial. He had been charged with murder again in 1928, and the witnesses in that case either disappeared or refused to testify. The pattern was established early, and it never changed. Anastasia would be known for the rest of his life by 2 nicknames, the Mad Hatter and the Lord High Executioner. The operation ran out of the back room of Midnight Rose's candy store on Saratoga Avenue in the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn. From the front, the store sold candy to children and was run by a woman named Rosie Gold. From the back, Anastasia and Buchalter managed a roster of killers drawn from Jewish and Italian neighborhoods across Brooklyn and Manhattan. The men waited there between jobs, playing cards, eating, talking, and received assignments through the chain of command. A syndicate member anywhere in the country could request a killing. The job would be assigned, and a crew would be sent. The killers had no personal connection to the victims, which made linking them to the crime far more difficult. They did not kill for personal reasons. They killed because it was their job. The methods documented in court testimony and investigative records ranged across everything available: guns, knives, ice picks, rope, and in some cases, fire. Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, one of the crew's most active members, was documented as having committed somewhere between 30 and 100 murders across his career, using whatever method had been specified for a given contract. The operations discipline was such that members were not supposed to discuss their work outside of operational necessity. Murder, Inc. functioned undetected for roughly 10 years. The investigation that broke it open began when Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer's office started connecting a series of unsolved murders that had one thing in common: the same network of men kept appearing in the background. Two low-level members, Anthony Maffiatore and Abraham Levine, agreed to talk. What they offered was enough to get the key figure in the room: Abe "Kid Twist" Rellis. Rellis was 34 years old when he was arrested in 1940, and he was looking directly at the electric chair. He made the calculation that talking was better than dying, and he began cooperating with authorities. What followed was one of the most consequential mob informant sessions in American history. Over 2 weeks, Rellis provided detailed accounts of 85 murders and pointed investigators toward evidence of hundreds more. He had a photographic memory. He named killers, described methods, identified victims, provided locations. His testimony was specific enough that authorities were able to locate bodies that had never been found. Based on Rellis's testimony, Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss and Martin Bugsy Goldstein were convicted of murder and executed at Sing Sing's electric chair in 1941. Harry Happy Mayoni and Frank Dasher Abundando were executed in 1942. Rellis had also provided testimony that implicated Buchalter directly in the 1936 murder of a Brooklyn candy store owner named Joseph Rosen. Rosen had been a garment industry truck driver who Buchalter had forced out of his business and who had been making noises about going to authorities. A fellow killer, Albert Tick-Tock Tannenbaum, testified that he overheard Buchalter issue the contract on Rosen. The jury convicted Buchalter of first-degree murder in December 1941. The New York Court of Appeals upheld the conviction and death sentence in October 1942 by a vote of 4-3. On November 12, 1941, before that appeal had concluded, Rellis was found dead on the pavement outside the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, where he had been held under the protection of 6 police detectives in room 623 on the 6th floor. The official explanation was that he had fallen while attempting to escape. The angle his body landed at made the accident explanation difficult to accept. He was referred to afterward in mob circles as the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. Albert Anastasia, whom Rellis had been about to testify against directly, was never charged with Rellis's death. He was never charged with anything connected to Murder, Inc. He walked free. Buchalter was transferred from federal custody to Sing Sing in January 1944. On the night of March 4, 1944, Louis Capone was taken to the execution chamber first and declared dead at 11:05 p.m. Emmanuel Mendy Weiss was next and was declared dead at 11:10 p.m. Louis Lepke Buchalter was walked in at 11:13 p.m. He wore his own gray trousers and a white shirt open at the neck. The right leg of his trousers had been cut open at the knee to allow the electrode to be attached. He did not speak. He sat down and looked around the room at the 36 witnesses present. He was declared dead at 11:16 p.m. He was 47 years old and remains, to this day, the only organized crime boss in American history to be legally executed by the state. Albert Anastasia ran the Gambino family for years after Murder, Inc. collapsed. He was shot dead in a Manhattan barber shop on October 25, 1957. Sitting in the chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel when 2 gunmen walked in and killed him. The Lord High Executioner who had survived murder charges, the collapse of his entire operation, and the death of every associate around him, was shot while getting a haircut. The last section of this video goes back to 1931 and the single betrayal that set the entire structure of modern American organized crime into motion. A lunch meeting where a boss sat down expecting a meal and instead got the last few seconds of his life, while his own trusted lieutenant waited outside. Section 10. The Assassination of Joe Masseria, April 15, 1931. Giuseppe Masseria had been calling himself Joe the Boss since the early 1920s, and for a time the title was accurate. He had clawed his way to the top of New York organized crime by eliminating rivals one by one, surviving multiple assassination attempts himself, including one in 1922, where gunmen ambushed him on Grand Street within a block of police headquarters and somehow missed, and consolidating the city's Italian criminal operations under his control. By the late 1920s, he was the most powerful mob figure in New York. He demanded tribute payments from other gangs. He traveled in an armored car. He had a reputation, built over years of violence, for being almost impossible to kill. The man who killed him was the lieutenant sitting across the card table from him. The war that led to Masseria's death had been running for more than a year. It was called the Castellammarese War, and it began in 1930 as a power struggle between Masseria's faction and a rival group led by Salvatore Maranzano, who had come to New York from the Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo. The two sides had been killing each other's men steadily through 1930 and into 1931. Bodies were being found across the city on a regular basis. The violence was eating into the profitability of every criminal operation connected to both sides, and the men underneath Masseria were running out of patience with a boss they increasingly saw as greedy, rigid, and unable to bring the conflict to a conclusion. The most important of those men was Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano had been with Masseria since the early 1920s, having been recruited as a gunman when he was still a young man on the Lower East Side. By 1931, he was Masseria's most trusted lieutenant and among the most capable criminal organizers in the city. He was also secretly negotiating with Maranzano behind Masseria's back. Luciano's calculation was straightforward. Masseria was losing the war. The war was bad for business, and the simplest way to end both problems was to remove Masseria himself. In exchange for delivering his boss's death, Luciano would receive Masseria's criminal operations and a position as Maranzano's second-in-command. When Masseria discovered that Luciano might be betraying him, he approached another associate, Joe Adonis, about killing Luciano. Adonis tipped Luciano off instead. Masseria had run out of people he could actually trust, and he did not know it yet. Luciano issued the lunch invitation personally. On April 15, 1931, Masseria arrived at Nuova Villa Tammaro, a restaurant at 2715 West 15th Street in Coney Island, Brooklyn, in his armored car with bodyguards. He and Luciano ate well: veal, linguine, red wine. After lunch, they settled in for an extended afternoon of card playing, a game of pinochle. Masseria, by multiple accounts, was relaxed and enjoying himself. The afternoon stretched on. According to the accounts recorded by law enforcement and organized crime historians, at some point, Luciano put his cards face down on the table and told his boss he needed to use the bathroom. Masseria watched his lieutenant walk toward the back of the restaurant. 4 men came through the front door: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Bugsy Siegel. They moved through the restaurant to the table and opened fire. According to later accounts, approximately 20 rounds were fired. 5 hit Masseria. in the head, back, and chest. His autopsy noted that he died on an empty stomach, which contradicted the lunch the two men were supposed to have shared and raised questions among investigators about the timeline of events that afternoon. No witnesses came forward. A confidential informant pointed police toward a gangster named John Silkstockings Giustra as one of the shooters, based partly on a coat found at the scene that was identified as belonging to him. That lead ended on July 9, 1931, when Giustra was himself murdered. The case was never solved. Lucky Luciano had an alibi. When Luciano came out of the bathroom, he looked at the body of the man who had employed him for a decade and had trusted him enough to sit across a card table from him that afternoon. He then sent a message to Maranzano through an intermediary. They had killed Masseria, not to serve Maranzano, but for their own reasons. If Maranzano moved against any of Luciano's people, the war would resume. The Castellamarese War ended the same day Masseria died. Maranzano took control of all New York organized crime, declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and called a large meeting at a hotel in Wappingers Falls, New York, where he formally divided the city's criminal operations into 5 distinct families. He recognized the groups that would become known as the Luciano, Gagliano, Mangano, Maranzano, and Profaci families, the organizations that survive in modified form today as the Genovese, Lucchese, Gambino, Bonanno, and Colombo families. That structure has defined organized crime in New York for nearly a century. Maranzano's reign lasted 5 months. By September 1931, Luciano had concluded that Maranzano was planning to have him killed, and he acted first. On September 10, 1931, 4 men posing as government agents entered Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building in Manhattan, disarmed his bodyguards, and killed him, shot and stabbed to death. The triggermen were recruited through Meyer Lansky and included Bugsy Siegel, the same man who had helped kill Masseria 5 months earlier. With both men dead, Luciano built the Commission, a governing body that gave equal standing to each of the 5 families and was designed to resolve disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. The whole structure that would define American organized crime for the next several decades was built directly on top of 2 betrayals and 2 bodies. A boss shot dead over a card game in a Coney Island restaurant in April, and his replacement stabbed in a Manhattan office in September. The Ace of Spades playing card, famously shown in photographs of Masseria's body lying on the restaurant floor, was almost certainly placed there by someone after the shooting. Masseria was playing pinochle, not poker, and pinochle does not use the Ace of Spades. The image of a dead mob boss with a death card in his hand made for a better newspaper photograph than the truth, which was simply a man who had trusted the wrong person sitting across a lunch table on a Tuesday afternoon in Brooklyn. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.